So with hotfix 69, there's been a lot of talk about the hotfix. I'd say the overwhelming response is that it's been really bad, but some people actually like it, and honestly, I'm worried that there are some people that somehow even find this patch acceptable in any way. Before I get into that, there's a few parts to the patch. The first thing they did was make everyone squishier. By a lot, actually, because not only did they remove 15 health from every single class, they also lowered the armor rating on like all items basically, and you also can roll, you can't get as much health on items and armor. That's the first change. The next change is they made Barbarian insanely broken. I don't know what they were thinking with these barb changes, but I mean, it's kind of insane because if you gave these patch notes to anyone and you said, you asked them, what do you think about these barbarian changes? It's pretty obvious that it's just going to immediately become like the best class in the game. So I don't know how that's even possible. And the third and the biggest and the worst change, in my opinion, was the change to items. Basically, what they've done is every single item has the same base stat. It kind of depends because weapons are a little different. We'll get into that in a second, but essentially, if you find a pair of reinforced gloves that are unique, they have the same base 5 Vig that the square reinforced gloves would have. So the only thing that matters on items are the random rolls. I think this is a huge problem because it made the appeal of like hunting for good gear in this game, which by the way is the only end game grind in the game currently, hunting for crazy gear. It made it extremely boring. Now, there are some people that argue extremely disingenuously, and they'll say that unique and square gear are the same. Okay, obviously that's not true. An item with no rolls is always worse than an item with some rolls, even if the rolls are all useless. Let's be like realistic here. Like, if you get a unique item, on average, it's gonna be better than the square gear, probably. But that's not what the whole debate should be about. It should be about the fact that it's such a small improvement that the gear progression in this game feels almost meaningless now. Like, realistically, if you just get green items with one roll, that's all you're ever gonna need. And then getting items that have multiple good rolls, it's gonna be a very small power increase for a very, very big investment. I mean, if you're buying a 4 on-roll legendary item, it's going to cost so much gold, and the improvement isn't really that much because the lowest gear in the game is already really good. The best way to put it was that on a scale from 1 to 10 of like the worst gear to the best gear, it used to be that square kit was like a 1, and then, full bis uniques was like a 10. But on this recent patch, it feels like square kit is like a 5. And then, obviously the best gear is a 10. But when the square gear is already so good, that feeling of progression and that feeling of getting better gear has been diminished immensely. I mean, also the gear just has been nerfed overall on the high end. I think that's probably fine. They could have just done that without completely just nuking all gear in general and making it extremely boring. But I think the equalization of gear, probably the worst update they've ever done to this game, especially because, as I said earlier, it's literally the only endgame grind in the game is hunting for good gear. And if you make that grind extremely boring and feel pointless, what's the point of even playing the game if you're not brand new and then, first learning things for the first time? Some of the replies I've heard to this are, some people say, oh, finally, the game's about skill, it's not just a gear check. I mean, obviously, this is just pure cope. Everyone knows if you're good at the game on the last patch, you could get good gear. That's just a fact. Don't get me wrong, there's always going to be gear diff in a loot extraction game. But that's how the game works. It's if you didn't want to ever get gear diffed, then you just wouldn't play this game, or you would just play in the square lobbies where everything's equalized. That's one of the things that I really don't understand is I don't understand why people want these fights to be just perfectly fair, but then they willingly play outside of the sub 25 gear score square lobbies where everyone is equalized. Because if you like the combat of the game and you want fair fights, we already had that. It's just queuing in with square gear, and then only playing against other people in square gear. Another thing related to the whole gear diff debate or whatever. Obviously, if you look at my gameplay and you watch my streams, I actually love playing SSF, and I love going from 0 to a really good kit. That's been extremely diminished and feels very unrewarding on the new patch. But you can just see from my gameplay, I'm not someone that just wants to queue in with the best items in the game and just kill new players all day that have square kits. That's actually insanely boring, and that's something I'm always trying to avoid in my lobbies. Feels like people don't really understand what the actual argument is. Obviously, I'm someone that doesn't need to just gear diff everyone. I can play it completely naked. You can see in my new series and even my old series when I made my first videos, I'll play the game naked. I'll outplay people and I'll get way better items. And then just from my last series alone, I mean, it was a short play session of maybe like 4 hours, and I went from literal 0 items to a kit that was probably worth 20k, and then I sold all the items for 30k. Not counting all the items I left on the ground. If you're good at the game, it's pretty clear that you could go from nothing to a really good kit in a short amount of time. I think making gear as worthless as it is, it doesn't make the game all about skill now, it just makes things extremely boring. Another thing I want to bring up is that if you recall, so before this current patch, I'm talking about gear on the last patch, back when, you know, poor items had 1 stat and then common items had 2 stats, you know, that whole thing. That was already a system where gear had been nerfed, and if you look back at like posts on like the Reddit and the Discord and on YouTube about when gear got nerfed to that state where it previously was, I just remember everyone saying like, finally gear diff is not a thing anymore, you can outplay people, the game's way more fair. And somehow we're back at the same spot right before the gear nerf back in the day, where everyone's just saying it's all about gear, skill doesn't matter anymore. And I've noticed this is a cycle in this game's lifespan that's happened over and over and over again, is that people will just, the gear will get nerfed, people will say, oh, finally it's about skill. I assume their games go poorly, they die, they get mad, and then they start complaining about gear diff again. The gear gets nerfed again. They're happy for a little bit, and then they end up complaining down the line. And this cycle is going to keep happening over and over until gear just does nothing. If the devs keep listening to the people that are constantly crying about getting gear diffed. As I said earlier, if you don't ever want to get gear diffed, there's already lobbies made for that. And I don't understand if you don't want to ever have a uphill or a downhill battle, I don't understand why you wouldn't just exclusively play in those lobbies. Because the game's already perfectly set up for you at that point. The devs need to stop listening to people that are constantly crying about getting gear diffed when they already have provided solutions to these people, and leave the gear as it was. Honestly, I think last patch the gear was in a great spot. And then they released one of the most loved updates of all time. And that was the update where they made looting actually good. Some people exaggerate way too much, and I actually can't believe some people didn't like the patch. They were saying legendaries were too common. I read a comment of some guy, he said that he was finding 5 legendaries every game in normals. I mean, it's just obviously a lie, just complete delusion. On average, you're not finding 5 legendaries in a normal game every time you run it. But legendaries were items that you could actually find when you go down to Hell, even in normals. That's how the game should be. And I feel like last patch, it was a good balance where you could play the game pretty casually. You know, you could do a couple runs and find some legendary items, and it was good. You know, and the legendary items were good because compared to the other items of lower rarity, even if the rolls on the legendaries were bad, at least the base stats made you that much stronger. And that was obviously a very loved patch, and they just completely 180'd. They made looting feel pointless, and they made gear feel unrewarding and almost pointless as well. I don't think any iteration of this patch is going to be good, and I really hope they just go back to the old gear system. My worry is that through some of the feedback, they're going to think that, okay, maybe this patch isn't great, but we can adjust a couple of numbers and it's going to be good. I think anything short of going back to the gear of the previous patch is just going to be a huge downgrade for the game and just a horrible decision altogether. Obviously, that's just my opinion on the matter. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts, and thanks for watching. Peace.